Today, we want to look at life lessons from some remarkable servants of God, which are both inspiring and equipping when it comes to our time in the Word. Revelation 12:11 says, "And they overcame him by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony, and they did not love their lives to the death." So we're going to be looking at some people who have particularly made a large impact on my father, and they fit into this category. Firstly, that they depended on the blood of the Lamb. That was their foundation. Secondly, that they lived a life in accordance to what they believe. And then finally, that they were willing to give their lives, whether that be all at once or one day at a time. So let's start in with number one, which is your father. And my grandfather, Boyd Nicholson, he was born in Scotland. He was an RAF pilot in training during World War II, which brought him to Canada, where he met his wife, my grandmother. And he returned to Canada again after the war to marry and settle down. After a stint as an advertising manager for 5 U.S. companies, he was commended to preach the word in 1960 and traveled for Christ until his home call in 2000. So what are some of the biggest lessons you learned from your father?
Well, sometimes a preacher's kid chafes against it, like, you can't go anywhere without being sort of the measure of your father's ministry. And that sometimes it's kind of a heavy burden to bear. Until a brother said to me one time, "Well, would you rather have Al Capone as your father?" And it kind of brought things into perspective in a hurry. One thing I really appreciated about my dad, he was always the same guy. He preached it and he lived it. And what you see is what you get. And that's huge. A lot of preachers' kids don't do so well because they think that their dad, when he preaches, is a different guy than when he's at the kitchen table. And there's a tremendous benefit in that, isn't there? The scripture speaks about whose faith follow. Now, everybody has foibles and failures, but you don't follow them in that. You look for the areas in which their lives are consistent with the Word of God and say, "I'm going with that." And my dad had a pretty tough upbringing. His dad was kind of a cantankerous old fellow, and never to my father's memory did he ever tell him he loved him. Never. Never felt a kiss or a hug from his father. But you know what? My dad filled our home with love. He made a commitment to that. And we always knew we were loved. And that's a tremendous thing for a child to grow up secure in their parents' love. I remember as a little boy, I can exactly remember the spot. We were crossing over Vine Street over the Queen Elizabeth Highway. My dad had been telling a story. It was a bit of a tearjerker, and I'd started to cry. And I was kind of ashamed of my tears. And so I'd kind of turned sideways looking out the window like this, and my dad in the rearview mirror saw what was happening. And in his soft Scottish brogue, he said, "Ah, son, may you always have a tender heart." And it's a tough world out there. And it's easy to get tough, to get jaundiced, to get critical. Long may you have a tender heart. When my father went to heaven in 2000, I really was in full flight. I was doing all kinds of stuff, traveling the world, preaching and all. And to tell you the truth, I really had overdone it. And I remember, I don't normally quote him in meetings, but I was listening to Garrison Keillor on the radio in the car. And he was talking about some Lutheran minister who at this point in his life should have his heart full of love and faith, and it was more like an old garage full of half-filled paint cans and rolled rubber tires. And I really identified with that, you know. And that year when I had my birthday, it was a big birthday, and my wife had got a cardboard cutout of me in my suit, full size, you know. And she didn't intend it for this, I don't think. But when I looked at that, I thought, you know, Nicholson, that's you. Like, you're this thick. You're going around the world telling everybody else how to live the Christian life, and like, what about you? I spent that night on my face on the carpet, and I had a lot of humble pie to eat, you know. I'd kind of roughed up some people. I had to use up all my frequent flyer miles, flying around the country and telling people I was sorry. Humble pie can be pretty good tasting sometimes, though, you know. But when my dad died, it was such a shocker to me. There were two things people said. Virtually nobody mentioned his ministry. Now, I know people loved his ministry. They loved his writing. They loved his preaching. Nobody mentioned it. You know what they said? Two things. He really loved the Lord, and he really cared about people. You know, I used to think, man, we'd have great assemblies if we just get the people out of the way. You know, I was like a snowplow. You know, move out of the way. I got things to do. Remember David Gooding saying one time, J.B. Nicholson, he likes to get things done. At first I thought it was a compliment, but then I realized afterwards maybe it wasn't. Because people are the ministry. Like, that's what we're building with. And so those were some great lessons I learned from my dad. I hope I never forget them.
Our second one, still staying close to home, is your wife and my mother. Louise, so you met as children and became high school sweethearts. She was a graduate RN, but spent her life raising 7 children. She raised us for God and supported her husband while doing this. She also had a massive prayer ministry, wrote 2 full curriculums of Sunday school materials, and co-edited the Choice Gleanings calendar for 20 years.
She's a hero in the story, you know. She's really the hero. In all the years I traveled preaching, never once did my wife ever express any regret that I was going away to serve the Lord. In fact, on a few occasions, I called her up and said, things are not going well, I think I'm going to come home. And she would say, is your work all done? Okay, you stay and we'll pray. If you went into our house in those days, you go to the kitchen cupboards. Every cupboard, when you opened it, had a different prayer list. And as she was apparently being a housewife, married to the house, she was nothing of the kind. She was a homemaker, and she was a prayer warrior. And to this day, you ask my wife, she knows the blood pressure of everybody in the Northwest Assembly in Grand Rapids. She knows what's going on with the Christians in St. Catharines, Ontario. She can tell you, missionaries, what's going on. She's in touch. And people wouldn't notice her, you know, but let me tell you 2 things about my wife. One was, she never said anything negative about me in public to other people. But she had the courage to come and speak to me when there was something that wasn't right in my life. Very few people do, you know. Nicholson's a bit intimidating. But my wife knew that it was her role in the home to minister to me in a way that I could be the man that God wanted me to be. I remember one time there was a young college student in our home in Mississippi, and this young lady was accompanying with a young man who was doing a fair bit of preaching. And she was a bit miffed that she wasn't getting much of his schedule. And Louise sat her down, and in her soft way, she said, Kiki, let Robert go, or let Robert go. That was it. Let him go serve the Lord, or let him go. And she realized if my ministry was what the Lord called me to, then her ministry was to stay by the stuff and to raise the family for God. And that's what she did. So she's probably my biggest hero. And I thank the Lord for Louise. There are lots of stories I could tell, but I just leave those with you. One of her little phrases was, 0 is a really good number. Many a month, our bank, the amount in our account was 0. But 0 is a good number. It's still not in the negatives, you know. And many a time I got up and left and went away preaching, and we split $10 between us. And she had to live a life of faith to raise those children for God. And thankfully, they're all going on with the Lord today. So that's what makes you millionaires.
Next we have Bill Powell. He was born in 1897 in Grand Rapids, Michigan. He was the lesser-known brother of Peter. Bill began producing gospel tracts in his early teens and eventually established Gospel Folio Press. He and his 6 sisters never married, but gave themselves to the work of God unsparingly.
Yes, I don't think I ever met people who were so totally sold out for the Lord. I've met lots of wonderful people, but I lived up close to those people, and there wasn't anything they wouldn't do for the Lord. My dad tells a story about going to Grand Rapids as a young man, and Bill Pell, he wanted to do a little shopping downtown, and Bill Pell drove him downtown and said, now, Boyd, when you want to come home, just go to a payphone. Anybody still remember a payphone? In fact, in those days, it was a dime. Go to the payphone, call me up, I'll come and get you, and here's the dime. That was Bill. I went to Grand Rapids for the first time when I was 15 with my family. And the rest of the family, they went to Rest Haven Homes and did a bunch of things. Bill Pell at that point was editing the Choice Gleanings, Uplook Magazine, a whole line of Sunday school papers, editing books, doing as much preaching as a lot of preachers. In fact, what he did was he had a bed in his office, a single bed, and he would work till he dropped. He'd crawl into bed for a few hours, then he'd get back up and go back to work. I don't think he ever worked less than 20 hours a day. And anyway, he took the whole day off for me, a 15-year-old kid. And he drove me around, and he talked to me about the Lord, and he encouraged me, and he gave me a job to write an article for a Sunday school paper. 15 years old. And he changed my life because of that. It's one thing to give somebody a token job. It's another thing to give somebody a real job. That's what, I was kind of loping along. I was ahead of a lot of the other kids because I grew up in a home where we knew who, King Hezekiah's second cousin was. But to be in that situation where, seriously, he's going to publish this? It changed my whole perspective on life. All of a sudden I thought, this guy thinks that God can use me, that I can do something worthwhile. I'm sure he had to heavily edit it. But it's not the last article I wrote for him. And I think of dear brother Bill. I could tell you stories all night about Bill Pell. But I just want to lay credit where it's due, that here was a man who put other people forward. I remember talking to Ross McIndy, who worked for Foster Wheeler in St. Catharines. And the Pells had a little conference on their property on the 4th of July because most everybody else went away, and there were a few old folks and singles that didn't have anywhere to go, so they put on a conference just for them. It was the first conference I preached at. I was in my teens. I preached with Peter Pell. And, Bill Pell was such an encourager of young men, and he put that into my heart to do the same. And Ross McIndy said, I was a nobody. I worked in Foster Wheeler, and Bill Pell met me at the Hamilton Conference and invited me to come and preach at their conference. And he said, I came down, and I was catching the train at 5 in the morning back to Canada. And the train tracks ran down the hill right past the Powell home. Well, it was, 3 or 4 houses down. He said at 5:30, the train passed the Powells, and all the Powell sisters were standing out by the side of the railway in their housecoats, waving to me like I was the president. They treated God's people like they were members of the royal family of heaven. And I don't think I ever left the Powells that they didn't come out and they'd have for me some snacks to eat and some money to pay for my gas. They always made sure that I knew that I was loved. And I just thank God for that family. They were such a huge influence in my life. And I just thank God for people who encourage young people in the things of God. Not with token jobs, but with real jobs that make you kick into second gear and get moving.
Well, sticking with the Powell family, Bill's oldest sister, Grace Powell, she had 4 preaching brothers, but Mel Trotter, who used to listen in on her large women's Bible study at the mission, said she was the best preacher in the family. Through the encouragement of George Mueller's friend, Abigail Townsend Luff, she gave her life to the care of senior saints at Rest Haven Homes.
Grace Powell was one of the godliest women I ever knew. If there's such a thing as sinless perfection, I think she was right about there. And I learned so many lessons from Grace, and one of the lessons she taught me was this. She lived a life of faith. God provided for them. They never charged for these people. A lot of missionaries had gone to the field before Social Security kicked in. They didn't have Social Security, and they didn't have mortgage houses, equity in their houses. So when they got back, retired from the mission field, a lot of them, their assemblies had ceased to exist. They'd been out in the field for 60 years, and they had nowhere to go. And the Powell family took them in, and they all moved into Rest Haven Homes with no visible means of support. And Grace and Bill prayed in God's provision. And she said to me one time, Jay, be sure to lay out before God all of your needs, but don't tell him the answer. He always has better answers than what you ask for. Isn't that good? And she lived that way. So much so that when they built the new Rest Haven Homes, which now is massive, they built it without a penny of debt. And it was all the provision of God. She would go and find these old ladies who were going to be sent to the poor farm, as they called it. Oh, my dears, you're not going to go to the poor farm. And she'd bring them home. And Bill sometimes would rent a house and put them in there, and they'd look after these people. They actually had a lady sent to them from a family who was not saved, out in, I won't tell you where, but they sent her as baggage with a tag on her to go to the Powells. And the Powells took her in, the dear woman. She was well past it in her mind, but they cared for her and loved her as if she was Jesus. Man, you just can't be the same when you see that. And they attracted people like that, One day, Bill Powell got a call. There's an orphan girl living up in Cadillac, Michigan, on her own. And she's going out and cleaning the flop houses where people are sinning to get a little food to eat. So Bill drove up there. He went to the address, and it was just an empty field. He went back into town, called home. Nope, that's the address. Went back and got out of the car, and he's walking across the field, and he came across a whitewashed chicken coop in the field, and he looked in, and here was this little girl. And she'd drawn little pictures of animals and stuck them up around to decorate her little chicken coop house. And Bill took her home, and she became the artist at Gospel Folio Press for 40 years. Mabel Carter. And, as I thought of the people that were there, people who were very often ruined, wrecked by life. One young lady who'd been so abused by her brother, she got there and she didn't say a word for probably 6 months hardly. She walked around with her hair down over her eyes like that, and they just loved her for Jesus' sake. And she just flowered, and she ended up being the person who cared for the last of the Powell sisters, chauffeured her around, looked after all her paperwork, her bills, and all the rest. And God provided that dear sister to help Lois in her senior years. So listen, folks, you're never in debt to God, right? He's no man's debtor. You give to the poor, you lend to the Lord. He says, I take that personally. I'll cover that. You can afford to be generous because God will always be generous with those who are generous in his name.
Next we have Ed and Gertrude Harlow. Both were missionaries at Nyankundi, Congo, and also founded Everyday Publications. Ed started Emmaus courses and the Bible School, as well as authoring over 150 books. Gertrude translated 75% of the Swahili Old Testament and scores of other books.
I think I could say Ed Harlow was the smartest guy I ever met. And I've met a few smart ones. He was probably the greatest visionary I ever met. And I think Gertrude, she was as smart as he was, but I think she was the hardest working person that I ever met. Ed had the good ideas and she did all the work. It was a nice arrangement. But Ed Harlow, at the time of the Second World War, he said there's no sense sending letters out to our boys on the front, hi, you know, the weather's fine, wish you were here. Let's write them Bible questions so they'll have to study the Bible to answer our letters. That was the beginning of the Emmaus Correspondence School. It was a great idea. It's the largest correspondence school in the world. He also was involved in, he was a pioneer in what's called everyday English. That's where everyday publication comes from. He says if people want to study the Bible, if people want to learn English, why not learn English by studying the Bible? And so he wrote the first books, and then others began to join in, where you use, I think it's a 2,000 word vocabulary and all simple structure sentences, you know, your noun and your verb and your, just all real simple. So people seeking to learn English can study the Bible by doing it. Only heaven will tell the results of this work. But Ed was such a child in his heart to his old age, right? I asked him one time, he was at an event with us, and I said, Brother Harlow, how old are you now? And he said, 92 and a half. 92 and a half. He said to me one time, don't let a little thing like death interrupt your ministry. Right? Get it out there so people can still benefit from it after you've gone home. And when he was, he must have been 94, and he was down in Florida. My wife and I were down there. I called him up. I said, brother, I'm coming over to visit. What'll we talk about? Okay, he's like about 94 years old. He said, tell me how to cover the world with gospel literature. Faint yet pursuing, right? Just keep chugging on. And we're going to think about that this weekend a little bit. Like, let's not stop living before we die, you know? There's lots to be done. And I just thank God for Ed Harlow. He gave me my first attempts at designing book covers, you know. He'd encourage me to do that. Some of them were ghastly, but he went ahead and used them anyway. And used to pay me in books. I could give away books. As he said, no, you'll get a reward in heaven, brother. You just give away the books. And then so that's what we did. But I just thank God for Ed and Gertrude. Gertrude was brilliant. She was brilliant. She was a genius. She actually learned this computer software, this computer program. This was state of the art when they computerized all of their work at the printing press in Nyankundi. She had to learn it. I think it was a Swiss company. She learned it in German. She translated the instructions into French, and then as much as she could into Swahili, and then she made all the mistakes it could make and found out how to fix them, and then she flew over and took this dear lady out of the jungle and taught her how to use it. That was a typical project for a person like Gertrude Harlow. Just a sweet little thing here. After Ed Harlow went to heaven a few years later, I was talking to Gertrude, and I said, Gertrude, what do you miss most about having Ed around? I thought maybe his sense of humor. She loved he had a great sense of humor. It was so dry, most people didn't get it, you know. But he was such a funny guy. But you know what she said? I think I miss his kisses most. Man. Anyway, thank God for Ed and Gertrude. Only heaven will tell how much she was in her 90s. She was translating Bill McDonald's commentary into Swahili. That was just for her retirement program.
Next is John Bramhall. He was born in 1899 in Sheffield, England, but moved as a child to Rochester, New York. He was Harold Harper's first convert. In 1934, he moved to South Carolina, then North Carolina, where he pioneered Christian radio.
Yeah, John Bramhall probably had some of the most Christ-exalting ministry you'll ever hear. A lot of his tapes on Voices for Christ, Gospel Folio published 2 collections of his material. If you're looking for something to feed on in anticipation of the Lord's Supper, his 2 little books, I Am My Beloved's and My Beloved Is Mine. They're just delightful. John Bramhall spent his senior years in Charlotte, North Carolina. And at that time, Billy Graham was a young fellow, and his mother, she tried to get her husband to come to the assembly, but I think he was a Presbyterian, he wasn't interested. And he finally told her, look, you go and join with the brethren down there. If that's what you want to do, you go ahead. And Billy Graham, years later, was on a platform with Harry Ironside. And he told Harry Ironside, you know, my mother was always a great Bible student, but she really began to grow when she got with John Bramhall and the brethren. And Harry Ironside said, yes, sooner or later, every serious student has to milk the brethren cow. That's actually in Billy Graham's autobiography. But when Ruth Graham's father died, Bell was his name, Melvin Bell, John Bramhall and his daughter went to the funeral. And when they were stepping out of the building, Billy and Ruth and their daughter Gigi were already in the limousine. And Gigi was a good friend of John's daughter, and so they greeted each other, and John walked over to the car. And Billy Graham said to his wife Ruth, Ruth, this man here, John Bramhall, he's the man that taught me the Word of God. And then he said, Brother Bramhall, I'd give anything to know the Bible the way you do. And John Bramhall said, well, Billy, you could if you just spend the time. It's true of all of us, isn't it? We could know the book if we just spend the time. When I was a very young preacher, I was invited to Augusta, Georgia. It was a strange set of circumstances that I ended up down there. It was God's kindness to me, because everywhere I went, I was compared to Boyd Nicholson, right? So after preaching my heart out, little old ladies would come to me, shake my hand and say, well, young man, you keep at it. Someday you may be half the man your father is, you know. Or they'd say, you know, your father is our favorite preacher. When's he coming back? So I just thought, you know what, I don't think I want to do this. I'll just do something else to pay the bills. But what the Lord did was he redirected me down to Georgia and the Carolinas, where my father was unknown. And the Lord allowed me to develop down there away from that pressure. And then eventually we did start preaching together. But after I'd sort of developed my own style, so to speak. Well, anyway, I was in Augusta, Georgia, and John Bramhall was there as well. And I was the new preacher, and he was the old-timer. He used to write choice gleanings for me, and he always signed his name, the other JB. Well, I took him for a ride in the country. It was the funniest thing in the world. A brother there who had been saved in the circus, he and his wife both had been saved in the circus, and they were quite the interesting characters. Edgar Murrah was his name. And he said to me, now look, this week you can have my wife's car, she'll drive my car, and I got a pickup truck. He said, so come around to the house, and the key will be under the mat, just take the car. Well, when I got there, I don't know how many of you remember this, but it was a satellite Sebring with racing stripes and mag wheels, and it just rumbled. And this couple were probably in their 60s, maybe a little older than that. So anyway, I start this up. Well, I was going to these little country assemblies. I'd have to, put it in neutral and turn off the key and then wait till everybody left before I started it. And so afterwards I said, brother, how did your wife ever get this car? Oh, he said, I was busy. I told her, go pick something out. And when she brought it home, she said, I like the gold interior. So anyway, here I was, John Bramhall and I, rumbling through the countryside outside Augusta. And I said to him, Brother Bramhall, I'm just getting started. Already I see there are lots of needs among God's people. What is the greatest need? If I'd known him better, I would have known his answer. He said, JB, what God's people need today is what they've always needed, more devotion to Christ. Just to love him more, right? That's it. That's the heart of it. I thank God for John Bramhall. There's a little incident about him. I put a book together called God is Faithful, and his story was so short I couldn't put a chapter on it, but I just put it in the intro. But when they were fairly new in the service of the Lord in the 30s, the dirty 30s down in the Carolinas, his wife got very ill, and they didn't have much money, but the doctor said what she needed was to get her to eat an egg every day. That would be good protein, easy to digest, an egg every day. He said, we didn't have money to buy eggs. But he said, a chicken from a neighbor, I, in good conscience, never tried to find out what neighbor it was. The chicken would come over to our yard and lay an egg every morning and then disappear until she was needed the following morning. And he said, every morning when my wife was sick, until finally the doctor said, now she's good to go, and then we never saw the chicken again. Anyway, thank the Lord for John Bramhall. By the way, listen to his ministry. It's just tender. It doesn't matter where he starts, he always ends up at Christ. You can count on that.
Next is Agnes McDonald, a dear friend of your wife, my mother, who represents an unnumbered host of intrepid women missionaries. Her biography is called Send Me to a Hard Place. Could you explain that title for us?
Right. Agnes McDonald said, Lord, there are a lot of people that don't have a strong constitution like I do. I can eat anything, sleep anywhere. So send those other people to easier places and send me to a hard place. And the Lord sent her to work on the border between Pakistan and Afghanistan. In the days when the Russians were driving into Afghanistan and they were pushing what were called the Mujahideen over the border into Pakistan. And she started medical clinics up in a region where the men were afraid to go, and gave the gospel to these people, who are now called the Taliban, by the way, same people. The Americans trained them, armed them to fight against the Russians, and they turned around and, Anyway, but here's a dear woman, Agnes McDonald, who realized we're not all the same. There are some people, and they can't take the rigors, but Lord, I can, so don't spare me, right? Her joy to to spend and be spent for the Lord. I thank God for Agnes McDonald.
Now, we said that she was part of this unnumbered host of intrepid women missionaries. Who are some of these other women missionaries?
There are just so many. Some of my heroes would be Pearl Winterburn, right? Pearl, her autobiography or biography is called "There's a Little Grit in Every Pearl," and she had a lot of grit. She had been given awarded by the president of the Congo the Order of the Leopard, which was the highest civilian order you could get, and that gave her the right to walk into the president's office unannounced anytime she wanted. When all the other missionaries left, Pearl stayed, and if troops came through that were going to wreak havoc, she would go and hide in the forest until they left, and then she'd come back to help with the repair the wreckage. On one occasion, there was this internecine war between two tribal groups. She ran out into the battlefield holding up her Order of the Leopard and told them to go home to their wives and families and behave themselves, and brought the war to an end. That was Pearl Winterburn. Saloa Brown, I met her. The Powell family had her visit, and Saloa Brown, she single-handedly ran a printing press in Chile. And she was up getting some supplies. We shipped a printing press down to her there. And this dear woman, I mean, the opposition she had, she was firebombed, there were all kinds, they tried to poison her, and she just sailed on for God. Just a wonderful sister. I think of Eva Wark and Eva Roundtree. These two ladies in Angola. Now, you know, Angola has the highest number of anti-personal mines sown in any country in the world. That's where Princess Diana went and tried to get, you know, because they have just endless supplies of amputees. People getting their legs blown off and arms blown off. And the Christians, the assemblies, have a huge encampment just across the border where they provide them with prostheses. And, you know, these people will come in limping on a stick or a branch, and when they're asked, okay, what do you want first? And well, Bibles and hymn books, right? You get us the Bibles, don't worry about the other stuff. Things like legs and arms, right? We need Bibles and hymn books. Well, these ladies would go down the roads that the military was afraid to travel on, picking their way along, asking God to keep them safe from the anti-personal mines, because, well, somebody had to go and visit these Christians in these villages. Two sweet little Irish ladies, astounding, just astounding to see them. They look like they ought to be in an old folks' home. But if you saw them as they really were, they look like superheroes, you know? So lots of people like that. I think I've got a couple more down the line if we get that far.
Next is T. Ernest Wilson. At age 21, he left the shipyards of Belfast for Angola. These were the days when you shot your own meat, built your own house, and had to learn languages yet unwritten. He walked 300 miles each way through the bush to propose to his wife, and then they had a honeymoon of a 13 days walk through the forest to their new field of service. He mastered Portuguese, Chokwe, Umbundu, and left 500 assemblies when he returned after 40 years.
Ironically, he was invited to a conference, I won't tell you where, but then they canceled when they found out he didn't have an advanced degree. You know. Anyway, one of the things I learned from T. Ernest Wilson was the 3 rules of Bible study, right? Number 1, accuracy. Number 2, accuracy. Number 3, accuracy. Although he was so busy there in the work, he every morning got up and spent a full hour in serious Bible study every day. And T. Ernest Wilson didn't guess He knew. If you asked him a question, he'd say, well, now, that word occurs 11 times in this book, and 3 times it's this, and 4 times it's this. Like, he didn't guess. He thought the Bible was too important just to guess. And yet, if you looked at this man, here was a man who, as I say, he worked in a shipyard, a tough environment. He went to Angola, and he lived in a tent. The tremendous challenges of living in Africa in those days. And yet, when he was older, he was in New Jersey, and a businessman had taken him out for lunch. And the businessman was paying the tab, and Mr. Wilson had stepped outside the restaurant door, and the girl behind the counter said to the businessman, "Who is that man?" He said, well, Tyrone Wilson from Seagirt. Do you know him? She said, no, but he has the face of an angel. And he did. He did. And just so you understand, my father said to him one day, Ernest, what has been the greatest battle of your Christian life? And Mr. Wilson, he had sort of big jowls, and he had a real soft voice, and this lovely cherubic face, little pink cheeks, white, snow white hair. He looked at my father and he said, well, Boyd, I'm Irish, and I had red hair, and I had a terrible temper. So Christians, there's hope for you. Hope for me in the things we think, well, that's the way I am. That's my mother was like that too. No, we can be new creatures. And that was the story of Tyrone Wilson. He let the Spirit of God work out the truth in his heart. And I'll just tell you a little story here. Mr. Wilson heard that one of their co-workers was dying of black water fever, made the journey several hundred miles, came there just in time for this young missionary to die in his arms. As he was dying, he was singing, sort of brokenly, the words, must I go and empty-handed? Must I meet my Savior so? Not one soul with which to greet him. Must I empty-handed go? He had just got to the mission field, and he died. And they had his funeral, and then the missionaries all went back to their other fields of labor. Some year, maybe months or maybe a year or so went by. They heard that something was happening in that area where the missionary had been, and they made a journey there, and here they discovered hundreds of Christians. And they asked, how did this happen? The first one got saved at that young missionary's funeral and led others to Christ, and others, until there were hundreds of believers. Not quite empty-handed, was it? That's why the Bible says, judge nothing before the time, until the Lord comes.
Next is Annie Spencer. She was born in Wales, but went with her parents to Trinidad in 1922. She worked as a librarian before being commended there. She started a Christian school and did a great work until she moved back to Wales in her old age.
I should mention Angola Beloved, David Tyrone Wilson's autobiography, and also some excellent books by him. His God's Sacred Secrets, the mystery doctrines of the New Testament, his chapter on the kingdom is worth the price of the book. It's what clarified the kingdom in my mind. He has some beautiful, a book on the Messianic Psalms. I forget what else, but I think they're all published by Gospel Folio. You be sure and get a hold of some of those. All right, so Annie Spencer. Her biography is called Triumphs and Trials in Trinidad and Tobago. I first met her in Cardiff. Her family was from Wales, and she had gone with her parents as a child over to Trinidad, had grown up there, and became a postmistress, a librarian. Eventually, the assemblies commended her, and she started a Christian school there and had a great work among the young. When you read her biography, she has a great sense of humor. It's a happy book to read. And when I met her, she had moved back to Wales in her old age. She had 2 canes, and she literally dragged her legs down the street. And, the young Christians thought twice about missing a meeting because they had a little cold or something. Because they'd all say, well, Annie Spencer will be there, so I guess I better show up too. A lot of the Christians there, they felt quite badly because all these foreigners were moving into Wales. And she said, oh no. We didn't go to the mission field, so God brought them to us. She would sit hour after hour, go through the phone book, and any name that looked like a Muslim name, she would write a letter to the lady of the house. And she would say, I'm an old missionary who has spent my life seeing God answer prayer. And I would like to pray for your children. If you will send me a little note with their names and anything you'd like me to pray for. She had a list of hundreds of these Muslims. Well, then she would, after a little while of writing back and forth to them, she would say, I'm going to be in such and such a park, such and such a day, such and such a time, over at a little bench by the fountain. And if you'd like to visit, please come and see me. And there she was, appearing to be a hopeless little old lady who could hardly walk. But, ooh, she had a sword. And she was ready to use it. The great thing about the sword of the Spirit? When it goes in, the people are dead when it goes in, and they're alive when it comes back out again. And here is dear Annie Spencer. People say she's a retired missionary. There was nothing retired about Annie Spencer. Faint yet pursuing, still going at it. Thank the Lord for people like Annie Spencer. She was a huge encouragement to me.
Next is Herman Lum. He was born in San Diego in 1916, raised by relatives after his parents died. He eventually attended Biola and college in South Carolina. He then rode horseback through Kentucky and West Virginia, teaching the Bible in the dirt-poor schools of Appalachia. He later planted several assemblies in West Virginia.
Brother Herman Lum was one of the humblest and gentlest people I knew. When I thought about this verse here, what does it say? I had it written down here. Oh yeah, you have given me the shield. This is Psalm 18, verse 35. You have given me the shield of your salvation. Your right hand has held me up, and your gentleness has made me great. I think of Herman Lum. He is such a gentle brother. And working among these tough coal miners in West Virginia, he was just such a dear brother. Never married, just gave himself to, he said, when you've got nothing else to do, there's always children's work and visitation. And he did a lot of it. When he was quite elderly, he moved back to California. By the way, his father died when he was just a little boy, but his father had been an evangelist too. And he had pictures of his father with a Conestoga wagon with Bible verses painted on it. This would be in the mid-1800s, going up to take the gospel and distribute Bibles among the Mormons up in Nevada and other parts of the interior. But anyway, Herman Lum, he was quite elderly at the time, in his 90s, and we had a lovely visit. As we were visiting, ding dong, here were two young Chinese Jehovah's Witnesses at the door. So they stood in the doorway and they began to, sell their wares. And after a little bit, I ventured in a few comments and so on. Anyway, it was all very friendly, but as we drew to the conclusion of the conversation, Herman had been silent this whole time, just standing smiling at them. And so one of the ladies said to him, "Well, sir, what do you think?" And he said, "My dear, I like your faces." And he said, "You know, I think you could convince me to be a Jehovah's Witness if I could find one Jehovah's Witness anywhere in the world who became a Jehovah's Witness just by reading the Bible." It was so gracious and kind and yet so pointed. I don't think they'll ever forget that. And it just reminded me that you can't antagonize and evangelize at the same time. That was the lesson I learned from Brother Herman Lum.
Next is Bill McDonald. He is probably the most prolific unknown author ever published, and he never took a penny from his books. He almost died in his childhood, but was miraculously healed, and shortly thereafter his family moved from Scotland to the Boston area. While in the Navy, the Lord used a line from C.T. Studd to bring total commitment. "If Jesus Christ is God and died for me, then no sacrifice is too great to make for him." Bill passed into the Lord's presence on Christmas Day 2007, aged 90, with almost 90 books authored.
You know, Bill McDonald could have been a superstar. I remember being at a conference one time, and the chairman was introducing him and said, "Now, Brother McDonald here, he has an MBA. It's from Harvard Business School, isn't it, Brother McDonald?" And from the front row on the tape, you hear, "Well, of course, brother, we left all that at the foot of the cross." You know, his little book, True Discipleship, was produced in the millions. He had the number 1, number 2, number 3 Emmaus correspondence courses, right? What the Bible Teaches and Christ Loved the Church. It was Bill who wrote those. He had the number 1 gospel tracts. I think the top 10 tracts from Good News Publishers were all written by Bill McDonald. I think number 1 was I Must Tell You This. So Bill had this vast ministry. He distributed millions of dollars of the Lord's money. Not because he had it himself. He had the oldest cars. I borrowed a car from one time. I had to stop and get a bunch of things fixed before I could drive it. He bought all his, you'd never know it, but he bought all his clothes at the Salvation Army. He used every penny for God. He lived in a little apartment. His desk was a rejected door that he'd picked up on 2 filing cabinets. He never looked dowdy. He always looked sharp, but he used every minute and every penny for the Lord. Bill McDonald had traveled the whole world. He knew Christians in every country of the world. And so I could say to him, "Brother McDonald, I'm going to Jordan. Who should I meet in Jordan?" He'd say, "Roy Whitman in Amman. I'll get you his number." He just knew the whole world. He knew the work of God. He had been thrown into prison several times, but he'd traveled the world, and he knew the work of God. And he prayed, seriously prayed. I was with him. We went into an old folks in Rest Haven Homes, into a room of this dear sister from Chicago, an Irish old sister, lovely saint. And the two of them, Bill and this dear lady, began to go around the world. This mission field, these missionaries. Oh yeah, his grandson is at the University of Illinois and studying this. And this lady was 96 or 97 and had this flawless memory. She could go anywhere in the world and she could tell what missionaries were there and where their kids were and where their grandkids were and what were the problems and the political issues, what they should be praying about. And when Bill and I stepped out of the room, I said to him, "That is amazing. How does she have a memory like that?" She prays for them every day. That's how to have a good memory. Pray for them every day. And you know, I think of Brother Bill, how humble he was, how gracious he was. And yet, here was a man who poured out his life for the cause of Christ. And he was so highly respected around the world. He could get George Verwer on the phone and get George to behave himself. You know what I mean? George highly respected Bill McDonald. And lots of people, the New Tribes Mission and so on, they realized that Bill knew God. I remember a brother from Germany was trying to sneak Bill McDonald's commentaries into Cuba, and he got caught. And he said to the fellow at the border, look, the Christians need these books. They don't have any commentaries. They need them. And the guy said, well, why don't you contact the department that gives permission to do this? Yeah, that'll help. He says, well, nobody ever tries. So he contacted the guy. Turns out he was a Baptist. And he said, well, I'll let them in on two conditions. Number one, you give them to the Catholics as well as the Protestants. And number two, double the number you're bringing in. So the only commentary they had in Cuba were Bill McDonald's commentaries. Again, he never mentioned it. It was just all for the Lord's sake, right? And so I remember driving with Bill one day. We were going along by Oakland, California, and here was this big Mormon tabernacle up on the hillside. And I said to him, look at that thing up there. And he said, yeah, I'm sure glad they build those places. Really? Yeah. He says, because then they don't put the money into literature. Yeah. Dear Brother Bill.
Next we have David Long. He served the Lord for 30 years in Angola, translating the Bible into Chokwe. He wrote many helpful books addressing important doctrinal issues like biblical revival, the meaning of the cross, God's timetable, kingdom parables, tongues, the deity of Christ, etc.
Yeah, now David Long didn't suffer fools gladly, okay? And he was a bit like the Apostle James. His words sometimes were fairly antiseptic. They did you good, but they sometimes stung just a wee bit. But if you could look past that, he was a tremendous brother. Again, a serious student of the Word. And he's got this book, God's Timetable. There's a little section in there. Again, it's worth the price of the book. He says, God revealed to Abraham what was going to happen from his day all the way through until they returned from the captivity in Egypt. And then God revealed to Moses what was going to happen from there all the way through until the kingdom. And then God revealed to Daniel what was going to happen all the way through the times of the Gentiles. And then in the Sermon on Olivet, the Lord Jesus revealed how it was going to be all the way through to the end. He said, if you study those 4 chapters, and he's got them laid out for you in that book, he said, here God revealed the whole history of the world from the call of Abraham all the way through until Christ returns to establish his kingdom. You know, that stuff's invaluable to have that at your fingertips. So David Long was a tremendous help. He spent 30 years in Angola. He was kind of an understudy of Tyrone Wilson for a while, and then he helped other young missionaries, as I say, translated the Bible into Chokwe. I mean, these are monumental things. Now we think about New Tribes Mission and some of the others, JARS, what do they call the people that do Bible translation? You know what I mean? Yeah, right. So we thank God for them. But you know, before those missions got set up, you know who did almost all the translation work in the world? It was assembly missionaries. Because, you know, if you're trying to raise funds, you have to tell people how many baptisms you've had this week, how many people have been converted, how many churches. Very few people appreciate, I translated one verse in John's Gospel. I'm not going to fund that. But see, God knew the value of that. And so these were the people. They were the ones who, Albert Horton and others, basically all through Central Africa, the translation work was done. And in South America and so on, the translation work was done by assembly missionaries. It's a huge field to study. So it's absolutely remarkable. Well, David Long and Tyrone Wilson, others, they were young men at the time. There was a senior missionary, Fred Lane, who was English, who came through Ireland and spoke about the need in what became known as the Beloved Strip, Angola, Congo, Zambia, Kenya, that whole region across Central Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa. And he pled with the young men to come to the mission field. And so the response of Wilson and David Long. Well, Fred Lane and his wife had one son, and that son was sent back to England for studies. And while he was there, his mother died on the mission field, and he never got to say goodbye. And he became very bitter against the evangelicals. And he moved to Quebec, and he went to Laval University, and he converted to Catholicism. You think of a bunch of Northern Irish missionaries working in a Catholic country, Portuguese. It was a Portuguese colony. And so Catholic was the official religion of Angola. And here they were working, seeking to reach the lost with the gospel. And one of their own kids goes over to the Catholic Church and marries a Catholic. It was devastating. That's all the story David Long knew. I was in Alberta about 6 months before David Long went to heaven in an old folks' home in Belfast. And I was at a camp, and I was standing in line waiting for the meal, as I often and want to do at these things. And there was a brother standing in front of me with a full beard, and we got talking. And he told me his name was Fred Lane. I said, well, that's interesting. There was a famous missionary in Angola. His name was Fred Lane. He said, yeah, that was my grandfather. Your grandfather? Yeah. I said, no, this Fred Lane, he only had one son, and he converted to Catholicism. He said, yeah, that was my dad. So, what happened? He said, well, I was going through for a Jesuit priest. And my last semester, I was sent up to northern Alberta to work at an orphanage. And the man who ran the orphanage was a brother in the assembly, and he led me to Christ. I spent all my time traveling around the assemblies in Alberta. I said, well, what happened to your dad? He got saved on his deathbed, seriously saved. And he said, my mother got saved too. You know, I went back, I was in Belfast, and I went to see David Long, and I told him the rest of the story. You could visibly see the load lift off his shoulders. It's like he'd kind of held this against the Lord all these years. Judge nothing before the time until the Lord comes. You know, we go through hard times, bitter experiences, and we think, well, that was a waste. Or our kids get astray. Or, you know, all sorts of things happen to us. God loves happy endings, and he knows how to pull it off. Don't give up on God. I have had the privilege of seeing the end of the story many times where other people maybe haven't seen it. And when I see it over and over and over again, I just have to say, at the present time, we're all prepared to say, he is altogether lovely. But some of us choke when we try to say, he has done all things well. Oh, most things. You wait, and you will discover that somehow, through all the twists and turns of life, he has done all things well. Lots of other people have been a huge influence in my life, some people in this room. And I just thank God for you all. But you know what it reminds me of? We are all in need of each other. We're parts of a body. We need each other. We need to encourage each other. We need to love each other. We need to help each other. And a young man said to me one time, your life and my life are opposite ends. I said, what do you mean? He said, well, you dance in the clouds and I drag through the mud. And And I said, well, tell me, is there any time in the week that's really happy for you? He said, yeah, every Friday I go over and help this old couple. I cut their grass or fix up in their yard or whatever, and we have supper together. It's the best time of the week. So, well, you know the formula. Just do that 100 times over. That's all it is, right? You see, there's one quote in the Bible that we don't know where it came from. Our Lord Jesus said, it's more blessed to give than receive. You believe that? Try it. You'll like it. And I think as we discover this, I am not enriched by getting. I am enriched by giving. And as I seek to invest in others, maybe there's somebody in the crowd here and you just need to go to them afterwards and say to them, I've never told you this before, but I thank God for you. I love how you treat your wife. I love how you raise your kids. I appreciate all the hours you spend in Bible study so you can teach us. Thank you for being my Sunday school teacher. I was kind of a wiggly kid at the time, but I learned a lot, and I'm thanking you for it now. Could we do that? I think there probably are people. Maybe we have to phone home and tell our mom or dad that. I don't know. But I think all of us would do ourselves, our own hearts good. You know, we give away words of encouragement like they cost $1,000 a piece. You can spread them around. It's a good thing to do. Encourage one another daily. Right? That's not a suggestion. And that's what it doesn't say weekly. It doesn't say in between the Lord's Supper and the family Bible hour where you say, hi, how you doing? Fine, good. That's good for another week. It's daily. Encourage one another daily. Let's find ways to do this. I was in Northern Ireland. I spoke on that verse. And I came back a year and a half later, and an elder came to me and said, see that young man there? Yeah. He's the most valuable member of our assembly. Seriously, yeah. He took that verse to heart. And ever since you left, he has been encouraging the people of God every day. He'll take cookies, he'll send flowers, he'll call up the old ladies and sing a hymn to them on the phone. And it's almost getting, too much. So it's getting contagious, and other people are doing it too. He said he revolutionized our assembly. Isn't that something? You don't need a special gift. You don't need money for it. Anybody can do it. And I thought to myself, how little we must be putting into practice if one young man applying one Bible verse revolutionized their assembly. Imagine what would happen if we all started to put verses into practice. We'd blow the walls off the place, wouldn't we? So, thank the Lord for godly Christians who have had an influence in our lives. Let's tell them. Don't tell them at the funeral. It's a bit late then. Tell them before they go. That's what we need to be doing.